There's no denying the fact that the Lord of the Rings film franchise, the Hobbit movies, and the Rings of Power series have amassed legions of fans around the world. However, with that being said, something is clearly missing. Stay tuned and don't go away because the Hobbit movies could be redeemed via a video game adaptation, plus the Rings of Power paves the way for a Galadriel video game. First up, was Peter Jackson's The Hobbit trilogy as well received as his Lord of the Rings trilogy? We're about to find out. Unfortunately for Jackson, the Hobbit trilogy was not as well received as his Lord of the Rings trilogy. However, a video game adaptation of the Hobbit trilogy might provide a clear path to redemption. Released 17 years before The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit was J.R.R. Tolkien's first full novel. Originally intended for a younger target audience, The Hobbit became an immediate hit with readers of all ages. It told the story of Bilbo Baggins and his dangerous journey to the Lonely Mountain. It's a classic fantasy tale, but Peter Jackson's movie adaptations weren't as well received as the books, and therein lies the problem. A possible solution, believe it or not, is video games. Following the success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy back in the early 2000s, Jackson was approached to create a Hobbit movie adaptation, but the Lord of the Rings production was so chaotic and damaging to Jackson's health that he declined the offer, and Guillermo del Toro stepped up to make the magic happen. But del Toro wouldn't sit comfortably in the director's chair for too long. After some creative differences, del Toro was pushed out, and Jackson reluctantly agreed to return as director. The Hobbit movies weren't well received by fans or critics, but many are now saying that a video game adaptation of the trilogy could redeem the franchise. Next up, were the Hobbit films successfully adapted from the source material? Well, yes and no. The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, was a solid adaptation of the source material. Martin Freeman's Bilbo Baggins was genuine and likable, and Ian McKellen's Gandalf was touching and moving. The film itself has a ton of heart and keeps audiences engaged throughout its lengthy runtime. The real problems, however, start to emerge with the release of the sequel, The Hobbit: The Desolation of Smaug. From the start, the sequel didn't have a lot of source material to draw from, and as you watch the film, you can tell that a ton of filler was added in order to increase the film's runtime. The problem only got worse when the trilogy's third and final film was released. The Hobbit: The Battle of the Five Armies essentially has no plot or structure and throws CGI armies at each other with no real motivation given behind any of it. The Hobbit trilogy is filled with unappealing, underdeveloped characters with no clear motivations, cheap-looking CGI, and runtimes that are unnecessarily long. The solution to redeeming the beleaguered franchise? Video games. A Hobbit video game adaptation, inspired by the movies, would redeem the trilogy in the eyes of the fans. If the game is a dud, however, it could have the opposite effect. Up next, what's the first thing a Hobbit video game should do? Let's take a look. If done right, a video game adaptation of the Hobbit franchise could work wonders to revamp it. With that said, the first thing a Hobbit video game adaptation should do is condense the entire trilogy down into one streamlined 15 to 20 hour experience. For example, each part of Lord of the Rings comes in at over 400 pages long. In other words, we're talking about one massive epic saga that's more than 1,200 pages in length. The Hobbit is just 300 pages long, which makes it even shorter than just one section of The Lord of the Rings. A video game adaptation of The Hobbit will definitely trim the fat, and it would keep fans happy, especially those who enjoyed the movies. The game should let players control both Bilbo and Thorin Oakenshield and offer two different types of gameplay. Bilbo's missions would see him sneak through areas like the Troll's Campfire, the Goblin King's Fortress, or Smaug's Cave. Thorin's missions, on the other hand, could see him battle orcs and Azog. The game could even throw in some side missions with Legolas. There are definitely some good moments in the Hobbit trilogy, but a condensed video game experience is the best way to redeem it. Stay tuned and don't go away because the Rings of Power is paving the way for a Galadriel video game. Next up, how soon could we see a Rings of Power video game? Not soon enough. While we don't have an exact timeline or release date for the Rings of Power video game, we do see a lot of potential for a Galadriel-focused video game. Amazon's Lord of the Rings series, The Rings of Power, just finished its first season, and it makes a great case for a Galadriel-themed video game. The Lord of the Rings has been a pillar of the fantasy genre since its debut in 1954, and while it may not be the first series to introduce the concept of elves, dwarves, and magic, it is one of the most popular and has stayed that way for the last 70 years. The Lord of the Rings has never faded from popularity and is still fresh in people's hearts and minds. The franchise has seen a boost in the last few months, with Amazon's new The Rings of Power show having just wrapped up its season finale. The Rings of Power takes place during the Second Age and acts as a prequel to the events of The Lord of the Rings. It has also paved the way for a Galadriel-focused video game. The series opens with a scene from Galadriel's childhood and focuses on the elven warrior, who later plays a smaller role in the events of The Lord of the Rings. In The Rings of Power, however, Galadriel is the primary protagonist and drives the plot. She believes that Sauron is still out there, and she seeks revenge for the death of her brother. Rings of Power has a long way to go before before wrapping up, but it's already providing enough inspiration for Galadriel's own video game. Up next, is the Rings of Power's Galadriel different from the one Lord of the Rings fans are used to? Let's take a look. Fans of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy and Tolkien's original texts aren't used to the version of Galadriel in the Rings of Power. The show opens with Galadriel joining the Elven army in the First Age, where she fights against the forces of darkness, which are being led by the evil Morgoth. The Rings of Power condenses these events into a bite-sized narration where Galadriel says that the Elven armies, including herself, managed to defeat Morgoth, Sauron's right-hand man, and his orc armies after thousands of years of war. At last, Middle-earth has been restored to a state of peace. Soon after the introduction, we see Galadriel lead a small unit of elven soldiers to the northernmost reaches of Middle-earth, where she believes Sauron has fled. She uses her elven skills to kill a frost troll and is forced to return to the elven home of Eregion, where she's informed by High King Gil-galad to stop her search for Sauron. Galadriel refuses, goes rogue, and the rest of the Rings of Power Season 1 sees her traveling across Middle-earth to stop the imminent threat of darkness. For the entirety of Season 1, Galadriel is shown to be a highly skilled warrior, capable of beating the most talented human sword fighters. Galadriel has all the abilities an elf usually has, including powerful eyesight, hearing, advanced agility, and even acrobatics and extra strength. Her skills and quest for vengeance make her the perfect video game protagonist. Finally, how much potential would a game centered on Galadriel really have? The short answer is a lot. A game centered around Galadriel has a great deal of potential. For instance, at the start of the game, players could control Galadriel during the First Age, where she faces off against Morgoth's hordes with her elven brothers and sisters. Galadriel would play like a typical third-person action protagonist, countering enemies quickly while delivering strong counterattacks. Players would have access to increased sight and hearing, which could be used as stealth mechanics. Even some parkour mechanics would suit the game well, with Galadriel's increased agility enabling players to take advantage of fast and smooth movement. The first act would be set in the First Age, and the game would have plenty of opportunity to show fans some creatures and enemies that are long gone by the time the Lord of the Rings trilogy rolls around. After Morgoth's defeat, halfway through the narrative, the game would have the opportunity to switch up its gameplay mode in some pretty cool ways. For the Second Age, the game could give players Galadriel's Ring of Power, Nenya. If you recall, in the original Tolkien text, the 3 rings of power forged by the elves remain secret to ensure that Sauron doesn't corrupt them and to keep their home protected from the darkness. Galadriel's ring, a simple band with a stark white adamant stone embedded in it, is only ever revealed to Frodo during the Fellowship of the Ring. Are you as excited as I am for a Galadriel-themed Rings of Power video game? Drop those comments down below and let us know your thoughts. And that's a wrap for today's video. Thank you for watching. Hit that like button and subscribe.